my impression, right? That's obviously, because this bill seems to have been a collection, seems to be a collection of various ideas put together and given a certain purpose thereafter. And as the good chair pointed out, there were other intents, just like the one which I pointed out, staffing ratio, which was opposed very extensively by all hospitals, and it was taken out, and that's a very good thing. But some other things didn't make it out. So one could say that prior to the amendment, this bill did include that staffing ratio, and that had really nothing to do with the loaded and extremely important topic which has been discussed here. So I strongly believe that this bill is a collection of certain ad hoc and some connected, some unconnected priorities brought together under an idea of racial justice to superpower it. Many of us believe that. Many of us cannot say that because they think that it would be just a little bit hard to call that out. But that's what it is. My constituents tell me that, and I don't believe a moment. I don't believe a moment, and neither do many, many people, that misintent doesn't exist. Mr. Speaker, I have one more question I would like to ask, if you would permit me.
Proceed.
I didn't find a definition of racism in this bill. Did I miss it? Or is it not defined because it's what it is? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm confused on a couple points. Just now, the good representative mentioned that we had a section that has nothing to do with racism. Though if you look at the title of the bill, it says an act equalizing comprehensive to mental, behavioral, and physical health care in response to the pandemic. To me, that is much broader than this conversation of racism, even though the first section of the bill declares racism as a public health crisis. So I'm agreeing with the representative. There are sections of this bill which are not directly related to racism. In fact, there are a good number of sections. There are at least a half a dozen. But to get to his other question, is racism clearly explained and defined in this bill? If we want to go back to the sections of the bill which deal with racism, indeed it is. I would refer the good representatives to lines 132 to 135, in which structural racism means a system that structures opportunity and assigns value in a way that disproportionately and negatively impacts Black, Indigenous, Latino, or Asian people or other people of color. So I hope that it directly answers the question he has with regard to an appropriate definition of racism, and again to agree with him that there are many sections of this bill which are not directly related to that subject. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Aurora.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the good chair to pointing me out to those lines. Indeed, going into 950 lines, perhaps it's sometimes difficult to get a handle of the whole bill. And I'm very, very pleased to hear that racism against Asian people is now a valid racism, because in many discussions, racism against Asian people was just an afterthought, and we heard that in some committee hearings, which was extremely distressful. But this does exclude, this is just with regard to race. So I want to understand which people does this exclude? White people? Is that right? Everybody else seems to be, I just want to see, sometimes it's a good idea to understand who is excluded. Perhaps racism is against a certain sect of people, so what I'm reading is, it says Black, Indigenous, Latino, Asian. Now, I think we're saying anybody other than white is being discriminated. Would that be the impression of this definition of racism? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I admit I remain very confused. I think that in the discussion this legislature, this state, and this country has had about racism, we've been pretty consistent about talking about groups, people of color, who have been the focus of such discrimination. But it is not our intent to exclude anybody from getting justice and fairness. And to suggest that any group not mentioned here, therefore, has been excluded and is subject to discrimination is certainly not the intent of this bill. We are focusing on people of color because there is documented history and effects of discrimination. And that's why we're focusing on that in the context of racism. So I hope I've answered the question. We're not excluding anybody. We're merely focusing on areas where we know that discrimination has occurred. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Aurora.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I really appreciate that answer because unlike many, I have lived that aspect of life in America for nearly 30 years. I don't know whether anybody wants to consider me a man of color or a man of, I have no idea. Sometimes I think people think of me and Asian people and Indian Americans as people of color. Sometimes they are overprivileged minority. Sometimes they get called out something. I'm also, as many of you know, belong to a Sikh religion, which has been particularly under attack, being gunned down very often. Gunned down. Killed. Because they're considered many times by certain people to be confused by turban-wearing terrorists. So I am no alien to discrimination. I grew up a minority before coming to this country and becoming a proud American. I was also a minority in a religious sense in the country I lived in before. And I did experience things, but I found the system fair. I found the government fair, even there. But I found many people who were unfair, who used to discriminate. When I read this bill, it makes me angry. It makes me super angry. And that was one thing I really wanted to restrain myself before I spoke. Because those institutions, the institutions we have in this country, are being called out to be all racist from the core in this bill. Every institution, every law, every law. When I look through this, I think the intent which comes out is that this body is racist. This body. That's what the intent is, because every law is racist at this point. And I'm not saying racist against, I'm just considering against me, because perhaps you would give me the luxury of me being a protected class or the aggrieved class in this law, because Asian Americans are also considered to have been racially discriminated and need all this protection from our institutions. I have lived this life nearly 30 years in this country. In my country, I call it, proudly, my America. And I will tell you, our institutions have their fault, but nothing to what this bill says. Nothing. And I've spoken to many of my friends who may not racially look like me, but who are included in this bill. And I've asked them, are we that bad? Do you go around there saying all these white people are just making laws to just get us down? I don't think so, my friend. And they say, no, no, no. There are bad apple out there. There are bad people out there. There are some bad laws out there. There's some remnants. There's something that needs to be written, perhaps. But the core is good. I'm angry when I look at this bill. You know what? One of the most important things to me is that achievement gaps, all the gaps need to be filled, need to be brought to zero. That's one of the reasons I left a private life and said, I wanna run for public good, because I think that's not right. And rationally, I've studied that as well. I've studied that rationally, I've studied that well, and I know why their achievement gaps exist in education. There's a number of things we need to do. And those things are politically very difficult. Because in some places you have to go against the unions. In some places you have to go against the administrations. In some places you have to go against vested interest. And perhaps in some places you have to go against historic laws, which are not fair. But what this bill does is ignore all the other important things which create those gaps, minimizes them to zero, and says the only thing which is important is the fact that our institutions are racist and we're going to change every law. Well, I have news. I have news from the proponent of the bill. By using race as a dividing factor, we ain't going to get anywhere. In the time period, I'm a student of history, in the time period between 1970 and right now, 50 years, we all know, a number of programs, a very large number of programs, were set up by various state and federal governments to just exactly what we're trying to do today, which is reduce the achievement gaps, reduce healthcare gaps, reduce all the gaps between different communities. And many of them, as we know, failed. You know why? That's the reason we are back studying them. We know that they failed. So it is not, if we study a history of our institutions, our history, we'll realize it's not for a lack of trying. Mr. Speaker, it's not for a lack of trying that we are here. It is because of poor policy. Some programs need mean testing. They don't have them. But they have vested interests which will stop them. And this bill continues in that pattern of poor policy. And it's going to end up with commissions, and it's going to end up with finger pointing at whosoever you can finger point at. But 20 years from now, we'll still have to rely on somebody coming in to make good policy. And the good policy is not difficult to figure out. It's the vested interests which are difficult to figure out. Mr. Speaker, in the interest of time, I'm going to sit down here. But I will just say this, that this is an exclusionary bill to one race. This is not a bill which seeks to eliminate racism. This is a bill which accentuates racism. I'm not going to point out which race it goes against. Discrimination against every race, Asian American, Black, Latino, or white, is discrimination. And perhaps I can stand up here and say that because I'm not white. But we have to acknowledge the truth, because the truth doesn't give to anyone. My ideals are Dr. King, are Mandela, are Gandhi. That's where I seek my justice from, my idea of justice from. They saw this, they fought against this, and of all, I have read Gandhi the most, Mahatma Gandhi. And the idea is, we are not going to get anywhere by revenge. We're not going to get anywhere by taking revenge with history. You do not do that. There is no purpose. All that comes from that is division, destruction, and blood. History has taught us that. So let's not create bills about taking revenge. Let's create a bill about good policy without excluding one race, excluding and calling out all the programs which were done with good intent, because that's the only way we'll do what we really want to do, which is close healthcare gap, education gap, and every single other gap which exists today in our society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative. Will you remark further on the bill as amended?